In today's video, I'm going to talk about why sometimes citrus trees just don't fruit. It's really frustrating, and there are a lot of reasons that it could be happening. Luckily, there are some things that you can do to prevent this problem, or maybe even some things you can do now to fix it for this season. Let's get into it. So let me introduce you to my pink variegated lemon tree. I love this tree, the fruit is amazing. And for the first couple years, I did get a decent amount of fruit. But then last year, what happened was it grew beautifully. It put on all sorts of new green growth. It had tons of blossoms. I was very excited for the fruit harvest that I was gonna get. But then it dropped all of the baby fruit and I got 0 lemons last year. Now luckily the tree is pretty enough that I still liked having it around, but I'd really prefer to get fruit off of it. So maybe something like that has happened to you with your citrus trees, where it grows and blooms really well, but then doesn't actually put out any fruit. Or maybe your tree is struggling to bloom at all. Maybe you get few blooms or none at all. So there are a lot of reasons that this can happen. So let's get into every single one, and most importantly, what you can do about it to prevent this problem from happening in the future. So the first thing to check for is just the tree age. How recently did you get this tree and plant it? So most citrus trees that you buy are grafted, which means they're grown and attached onto a dwarfing rootstock to help keep them at a smaller size. And that's what all of mine are, because I'm growing them in containers, so I want to keep them contained. And they're also great, by the way, because you get more fruit for the size of the tree. But one of these grafted dwarf citrus trees is still going to take 2 to 3 years before the tree is ready to put out fruit. Because before that, it's just going to be growing. It's going to be getting a root system going, growing lots of leaves and shoots, so that way it can support that fruit later on. So if you have a full-size lemon tree that's not grafted, so if you have a big citrus tree that's planted in the ground, say, it's going to take probably upwards of 5 years before you're going to get any kind of significant fruit harvest. So if your tree's really young, you may just need to wait around a little bit. Now, if you planted your tree from seed, if you just saved a seed from a lemon and planted it and it's growing, that's awesome. That's a really fun project, but beware, because it could take 7 to 10 years before you're going to see any fruit on that tree. Or possibly never, because when you plant a tree from a seed like that, chances are the plant that's going to grow is going to be genetically different than the one that the fruit originally came from. It's a very strange thing that happens, and so it's very possible that that tree might never fruit at all. So just beware. You're probably better off buying either a full-size tree or one of these grafted dwarf trees. The other thing to keep in mind is that not all citrus trees bloom at the same time of year. So you want to think about what time of the season is it. And this is true even just among lemon trees. So for example, that pink variegated lemon, it's related to a Eureka lemon, which is one of the most common ones you can grow. And it tends to send out its blooms in early spring. So it is still finishing up blooming right now in late spring. But this is a Meyer lemon tree, and Meyer lemons bloom off and on all throughout the year, but its main blooming period is actually in the fall and winter. So if you can see on this tree, the little young fruits that are on here are actually much more developed. They're closer to the size of a quarter because the tree bloomed a lot earlier, and so the fruits have had more time to set and develop already. So keep in mind the season that your tree is supposed to bloom. Most of the time that's going to be spring, but not always. So now let's talk about fertilizing, because this is one of those things where you can't do too much and you can't do too little. Both extremes could cause the tree to just drop whatever fruit it has. So obviously you need to give the tree nutrients so that it can grow fruit, especially if you're growing a tree in a pot. Really, you have to provide all the nutrients because the roots don't have room to go spread out under the ground and get what they need. So you do have to fertilize. And at certain parts of the season when it's really hot and I'm watering frequently, I may fertilize these trees as often as every 2 to 3 weeks. Just kind of depending on the weather and what time of year it is. So it's going to take a little bit of experimentation. And for example, example, I've noticed that this Meyer lemon tree needs more fertilizer than my other citrus trees. You can see I have some yellowing leaves, especially the older leaves, which is an indication of a nutrient deficiency. The new growth looks good, so this may be a past problem, but it's really important that I keep a regular fertilizing schedule. On the other hand, you don't want to fertilize too much because that's going to signal to the tree to use all those nutrients and just put out a ton of leafy growth. And then it won't be able to grow fruit because all of its energy is going to leaves and shoots. So it's a balancing act. It may take some experimentation, but assess whether or not you're fertilizing too much or too little. Another thing that could be causing fruit dropping is watering, whether it's too much water or too little water. Any sort of stress related to inconsistent watering can cause fruits to drop because the tree, whether it's waterlogged or it's sort of in drought mode, it's trying to survive. And the first thing it's going to do is drop the fruits. That way it has the energy to conserve what it needs to just stay alive. So consistency is key when it comes to watering. Another key is making sure that it's planted in soil that drains really, really well so it's not getting soggy and waterlogged. I'm going to link to an article that I have on the Fruit Grove blog that talks all about citrus tree potting soil and what's the best kind of soil you can use to pot up your citrus trees. But what you need to know right now is to water consistently. You can check to see if your tree needs watering just by sticking your finger in the soil. I like to stick it up to about the second knuckle there. Stick it into the soil. If it feels moist, you can hold off on watering. If it feels dry, which mine does right now, so I do need to water this tree, then give it a really good soak. Let water run out of the base of the pot, let it flush through so that you know you're getting the whole root ball wet. You don't want to wait too long, but you also don't want to overwater, like I said. So consistency is your friend when it comes to watering. Another thing that could prevent a tree from blossoming in the spring is cold damage. If the tree has been out in the cold for too long, again, it's a stressor. And it may mean that the tree is then using its energy to try to recover from that and send out new growth to make up for the parts of the tree that died. And it's not going to have energy left over to flower and fruit. So if your tree got a lot of cold damage this winter, this may be a year where it just doesn't put out any fruit. And that's okay. You want it to get better. You want it to recover strong so it can fruit again for years to come. Okay, this is a big one, especially if you're having trouble getting blossoms on your tree, and that is sunlight. Citrus trees love sun and they need a lot of sun. I'm talking 6, 8+ hours of direct sun a day, specifically for fruiting. Now, you may be able to plant a citrus tree or put the pot somewhere that gets a lot less sun than that, and it may look like it's growing just fine, but it will struggle to put out blossoms and fruit if it's not getting enough sunlight. So keep that in mind when you're figuring out where to plant your tree or where to situate your pot. If you're growing a citrus tree indoors, be sure it's placed by a really bright window, and then go ahead and bring it outside as soon as those nighttime temperatures go above 40 degrees or so. So that way it can get enough light to develop those blossoms and get fruit going. So let's talk about pollination, because if you're noticing your tree has a ton of blossoms but you're not getting much fruit, it could be a pollination problem. And this is especially an issue if you're growing your tree indoors, because if there are no bees and other insects buzzing around your home, then the flowers are not going to be pollinated. So there's a couple things you can do. For one thing, just make sure your tree is in a place where there are other blossoming plants around, so you're attracting pollinators to the area. But if you're growing your tree indoors, simply bring it outside as soon as those temperatures start to warm up in the spring and the tree starts blossoming. If you don't want to do that, or if your tree's too big, you can hand pollinate. All you have to do is take a small paintbrush and just gently grab the pollen from the male stamens of the flower and just gently kind of spread that onto other blossoms. Just kind of go from flower to flower all over the tree, and that should be enough to do the trick. A really common thing to happen with citrus trees is called alternate bearing, and that's where the tree puts out a ton of fruit one year and then the next year it has to recover, and so it doesn't put out any or hardly any fruit at all. And this is a really common thing with fruit trees in general. One of the ways to get around this is to thin the fruits on your tree. When they're really, really small, just like I have now on this key lime tree, you can go ahead and manually just pull out some of the fruits to just thin the clusters a little bit so that the fruit that's left can grow and mature and you're not using up too much of the tree's resources. And that'll mean a more consistent crop from season to season. The good thing is citrus trees do their own self-thinning pretty commonly. Usually they'll put out a ton of blossoms, you'll see tons and tons of baby fruits all over the tree. But then as the spring goes on, you'll notice that a lot of the fruits will fall and just drop naturally. So you may not have to do any thinning at all. But if you suspect that your tree has too much fruit on it, it may pay off to go ahead and pull some of it off while it's young to ensure that you're going to get a crop every season rather than a heavy harvest one year and nothing the next. Okay, so I'm back to my pink variegated lemon tree because now we get to the one that was my problem, the reason this tree didn't fruit last year. And that's because I had it planted in too small a pot. And you know, it grew, like I said before, beautifully, so I didn't suspect this right away. But this winter I went to repot this tree and sure enough, it was jam-packed with roots. There was barely any soil left in the pot. So it was no wonder that the tree couldn't put out any fruit. It was just trying to make it, you know, it was just trying to survive. So that is a really simple thing that you can keep an eye on for your potted citrus trees, is to just make sure you're potting up in size every couple years to make sure that the roots have enough room to grow, that there's enough soil so that the tree can get the nutrients that it needs to fruit. I have a video on that of how to repot your potted fruit trees. It's really, really simple, but it's probably the single thing that might make the biggest difference for you because it definitely did for me. Thankfully, it's now the following spring and I'm seeing tons of little fruits still on here, starting to grow bigger and bigger. So I know this year I'm gonna get some really great lemons off of this tree. So I really hope this video helps you figure out why your citrus trees didn't put out any fruit, or maybe why they're struggling this year. It might not be too late. You can do some of the things that we talked about in this video right now, and you'll probably see a pretty quick difference in how your tree grows and fruits. So let me know in the comments, what kind of citrus trees are you growing? Have you ever had this problem before of them not fruiting for a season? I really hope that this video helps you troubleshoot those problems. And it might not even be too late to make a difference for this current growing season. Go ahead and do some trial and error, figure out a watering regimen, fertilizing, sun exposure, all those kinds of things, and you'll probably see a pretty big difference in how the tree grows and fruits. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.